Wonderful. Well, I would like to start and welcome everyone to the webinar. And I would like to start with short introductions. I'm Anna Navarro, founder and CEO of Phi Networks, an investment advisory firm that works with early stage technical founders and venture funds. And we have Sheetal Nariani, Gary Goldman, and Neil Ray today. I would like to pass it on to you with introductions. Gary, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks, Anna. And I'd like to welcome Neil to the webinar as well. So I'm Gary Goldman. I've got a 35-year history in healthcare, and I pretty much played every operator role there is. I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I'm also an informaticist for a 27-hospital system. And about 7 years ago, I founded the Global Health Impact Network and Funds. We're a health professional founded, driven, and managed strategic venture capital fund and a digital health global innovation network.
Sheetal?
Thank you, Anna. Sheetal Nariani. I'm the general partner and CFO with Global Health Impact Network and Funds. Been with the organization for over 4 years now. My background, I've been in healthcare for almost 20 years, but in a management profile. I started my career back in 2005 in India, fresh out of a B school and an undergrad in microbiology and sales and marketing. For 5 years, I was a brand manager for some of the major pharmaceutical brands. We were distributing in international markets. Around 5 years down the line, I had changed towards corporate finance. I was in the world of mergers and acquisitions based in Middle East, operating and a combination of India and Middle East. I moved to US 8 years ago to be a part of the Stanford community, graduate of the Stanford Business School and public policy. After which I joined venture capital. I'm a partner with Gary, and there's no looking back. It's a wonderful experience and one of the best moves I could have made in my career.
Neil?
Hi, everyone. My name is Neil Ray. By background, I'm a pediatric anesthesiologist, CEO and founder of Raydiant Oximetry. I've been in clinical practice for 20 years. I'm still clinically active. And about 10 years ago, I had this realization that we could be doing a much better job taking care of mothers and babies during childbirth. So I founded Raydiant Oximetry in 2018. We are a portfolio company of a Global Health Impact Fund, and I'm delighted to share our story today with you all.
Thank you very much. And we will start by, I will moderate the conversation, and I'll start by a series of questions for the group, and then we'll open it for a Q&A for the audience. So we'll start with Gary. You've shared earlier that you've been in this both as a clinician and as an entrepreneur for a long time. So I'm curious, how does the clinical perspective challenge or enhance traditional venture capital thinking? What does your experience as a clinician brings to the fund, and how you help entrepreneurs like Neil navigate the landscape?
Okay. Well, it's a complex, answer in a way, in that, as I said, about 7.5 years ago, as I was consulting all over the country from an electronic healthcare perspective, everywhere I went, all the clinicians that I met were disenfranchised, were very unhappy with a lot of the technology that was coming out because it lacked clinical input. Okay, a lot of the, there were hundreds of millions of dollars being invested in companies, and then when they would commercialize, the clinicians, most of us would look at it and say, "What is this? I mean, this doesn't help our workflow." So after 3 of my own companies, I realized that what really needed to happen is we needed to create a place that allowed very busy clinicians in a trusted, secure environment with their own colleagues to be able to create an ecosystem which would cover everything from due diligence all the way through commercialization of a company for founders and startups. So we created the network and the fund with the concept. My vision was a place where clinicians could comfortably, actively participate as advisors, as consultants, educate themselves about innovation, about healthcare and tech, and then actively participate in the process. Now, who better to choose the market disruptive early companies than the clinicians themselves. So that's where we started. So we created a fund, we raised the capital for it, and then the LPs were actively involved in choosing the companies that we invested in. And then in the background, we created the network component of it, when the network provides all of the resources, not only for the due diligence, but when we do invest in a company, that network and all its resources, its business development, its international commercialization abilities, all comes in play for the portfolio company that we work in. And we're actively in the background. I jokingly always say we're venture capitalists, not vulture capitalists. We're there to help the companies, and we have aligned incentives.
Thank you. And Neil, since you are in the room, can you speak to this on the other side of the table as an entrepreneur, but also as a clinician, of course?
Neil, you're on mute.
Sorry. When I think about Gary and the Global Health Impact Fund, I have not met an individual as accomplished as he has and as appropriate for this type of a role. I mean, let's talk about Gary, his experience. He's an obstetrical anesthesiologist, so he knows labor and delivery like the back of his hand. His wife is an obstetrician who specializes in maternal fetal medicine. And so he's got a very strong clinical acumen, clinical background. He also has started his own companies and successfully exited. So he's got deep experience as an operator, and he seems to have a pretty good nose for picking successes. He's had more exits in the short amount of time that I've known him, and that's 8 years, than most professional VCs. So Gary is in very much a triple threat, right? And when you got Gary supporting you, it's like he can support you in a way that professional VCs have no ability to. So I think that's very attractive when it comes to working with GHIN. And I think as anesthesiologists, we are pretty well adapted at understanding how to develop fast, react, and pivot. Because that's what we do every day in our clinical career. And so a lot of the skills we learned as clinicians are actually very translatable to running a company. And I think it's been a great partnership to be able to work with Gary for those reasons.
And you mentioned, Neil, the word partnerships. How do you think about your capital partners as well? You've grown quite a lot. Congratulations on the successes. But if you could speak about what were you looking for in a capital partner as a clinician, but also as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, so the reality is when you're starting off, you're desperate for money because you need money to make progress. So you'll kind of take money from anyone who's willing to give it to you. But then as you grow and mature, you realize that you don't just need money, right? Some money, you call it dumb money. You don't want dumb money, you want smart money, right? Because at the end of the day, if you've got a good idea, a lot of people are going to be willing to give you money, but they're going to give you a lot of advice as well that you don't necessarily need or would benefit from. And so I think that's where GHIN has been a great partner, because it's not dumb money, it's very smart money. And I think Gary understands when to get involved and when not to get involved, because I think some of my other funds tend to get involved in ways that maybe aren't necessarily helpful because they don't understand labor and delivery. When you think about the hospital, labor and delivery is somewhere no one wants to go unless they absolutely have to. So very few people go into that environment and really truly understand what happens behind the closed doors in labor and delivery.
Thank you. And Fetal, as being on the other side as a CFO and a GP of the fund, how do you balance the clinical rigor with the need for venture scale returns when evaluating potential investments and founders like Neil, especially very early on?
When I first joined the firm, now traditionally in my role in finance, you tend to look at how are the revenues, how are the business models, how are the financials looking like. But in healthcare, and thankfully, because I spent so much time in healthcare, this does not hold true, especially in early stage startups. You look at technology, you look at the end users, how happy or how convinced are they? And this is why the GHIF model works. When I have spoken to many VCs, as you might have noticed, there are not a lot of VCs which are dedicated only to healthcare. Yes, VCs invest in healthcare, but it's usually a part of their portfolio, rarely the 100% of their portfolio. This is changing slowly, but this is true. Why is that? Because you tend to depend a lot on the technology, on the founder's vision, perspective, what problem they are solving, and how are the clinicians who are going to be the end users of this technology, how are they going to accept it? Your decision is not driven purely by finance. Finance is important. Let me not undermine that part, but that is not the sole driving decision factor. And this is where we see struggle. And I'm proud to say this is where we have been able to align the need to understand finance, analyze the financials, but also analyze the technology and have that balancing act. And the network is the driving force behind it. We have so many clinicians, LPs are so actively involved. A business model has helped us make this balance perfect for us, and also for the companies that we invest in.
Yeah, and you've been building the network your entire career. I think you're one of the best people at building relationships. Could you speak about your vision for the network and how the network can work with entrepreneurs like Neil in supporting them, accelerating the growth, evaluating the investments, and really being a long-term partner?
Sure. The network side of the operation is an interesting place because it's really been an evolution. Its initial intention, well, let's start with when, you're cogitating about starting a concept like we did with the network and the fund. I always, somewhat joke about this all the time because, we're not the only one out there who's, a clinician-driven organization that, is providing some education and some resources for other entrepreneurs. But very few have entered into the actual capitalization side of it. And, it's funny because, of course, it makes a lot of sense, but it's also absolutely necessary because when you look at a lot of what's out there, they're either non-for-profit organizations. And I always, I can't help it. It's the business in me. I say that they don't have a financially sustainable model. You can't expect, clinicians to come in and pay $100 a year to create an environment because it's just not enough sufficient capital to do what's necessary to grow a network. I mean, look what's out there: LinkedIn, Facebook, all of these, non-secure environments, and they spend hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, creating those networks, right? So you need money to create a network. So when we first started, the idea was to start with the fund because then the fund, which utilizes the network for a lot of what's necessary for the uniqueness of our fund, provides a service. So now the fund can capitalize the network. And the network, by the way, is an investment of our first fund. It's one of the 11 companies. So, so the capitalization becomes very important. So you have, in our minds, even every one of our LPs, unfortunately, we're not an institutional fund, right? We're a fund of individual clinicians and health professionals, right? So, the average investment can be somewhere around $100,000 as accredited investors, but I have to deal, as you point out, with each one of them, right? To get. And the SEC only allows us 99 investors or 249 if you stay under 10 million. So it's not like you can create a huge network on a venture fund anyway, because you can only have a limited number of investors, unless of course you go down the crowdfunding route. So, so it was very limiting to us. But at the same time, we have a fiduciary responsibility to our investors to leverage the network as much as possible and minimize the amount of money that's transferring from fund to network, unless it's really providing resources to help the portfolio companies exit. That's how we make our money as a fund. So, So the network has played a very, very important role in the first 5 years, selecting the companies, supporting the companies, getting us, as Neil pointed out, we had an exit, our first exit was after about year 4 or 5, which is pretty unusual. And it was all because of what the network provided. But now we've evolved into, now we need to take the network and grow it in a global way with not a couple of thousand clinicians, but possibly 500,000 clinicians all over the globe. Because at the end of the day, the valuation of a network is based on what? It's eyeballs, right? So, but it has to be actively participating eyeballs. So it's a real balance for us, how the network has evolved, because we've got over 300 communities, but only a small amount of them are used to drive the fund itself. The rest of them are to, provide an environment for collaboration, communication, education by the clinicians who are subject matter experts in each of these targeted areas in each profession and specialty. So it's a real balance to make it profitable, but at the same time provide what it needs to provide to make our fund model sustainable and unique in the way we've created it. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you. And Neil, you spoke earlier about smart money and investors who had subject matter expertise and access to networks potentially. I'm curious how this has changed from the early days of Raydiant and now as you're entering the new stage and you're more focused on commercialization and scaling. How did your perspective on your investment partners have evolved?
Certainly, as you mature, your needs change. And in the beginning, it was all around networking and making sure you have enough capital to establish proof of concept. And now that we're entering a commercial phase, it's about which hospital systems are open to doing pilots. So you want to have partners that can grow with you, and they're growing as well. I think Gary has matured as a venture capitalist. When you do something for a decade, you become good at it, right? You don't know everything the first day. So it's almost like this lifelong commitment to learning and development and getting better, and we're growing together. And I may ask Gary, hey, we have we're looking for this, and he may not necessarily know that, but I know that Gary's going to dig into his network and figure out who has that resource or who knows how to handle it, and it's just we're a partnership. It's about growing together and understanding the needs for our current situation and our upcoming situation, and working together to figure out how we're going to address it. It's almost like Gary's fund is a startup as well. It's a startup mindset. Even though it's a venture fund, it's a startup, right? It's a lot of the same DNA as in our company is in his company.
And I'm curious, Neil, as funds had to do due diligence on you and your company, how did you go about doing diligence on your capital partners?
Yeah, you'll ask portfolio companies, how are they as partners, and some will say stay away. Don't bring them on the board. They're a pain in the butt, right? But the reality is, very few companies have the luxury of saying no to capital. In a tight, healthcare is difficult. There aren't, as Sheetal said, there aren't a lot of funds that are exclusive on healthcare. The average medical device requires about $50 million in capital to go from concept to FDA clearance or approval. So that's a lot of money, right, to sink into a concept before you're able to even start selling it. So it just makes I forgot what the point I was trying to make.
That not always there is a luxury to be diligent.
Yeah, exactly. You don't always have that luxury. So you hope that it ends up being a good fit. And I think funds do the same thing, right? That they want to make sure it's a good fit too. So they may be able to allocate more capital up front, but they choose not to. They're going to make a small investment, sit on the board, see what kind of progress you make, and they're going to decide if they're going to be a lifelong partner or a short-term partner. And so it's both ways, right? They're diligencing us, we're diligencing them.
Yeah.
And when
Yeah,
it
and
works out, then you've got you know, a special situation like we have here.
yeah, and talking about this special situation here, since GHIF invested number of times, and it's been both a financial and strategic partnership. Sheetal, could you speak about ongoing support, why you're choosing to reinvest, increase your stake potentially, and continue to stay involved with a company like Raydiant?
I mean, before I jump into that, I wanted to actually continue on Neil's thought process with how our value system and ideology is. Gary pointed very early on that we very actively believe in the aspect of genuinely being venture capitalists and not vulture capitalists. It is a very thin line, and it is a very important differentiation. It is important for us, Gary and me, to make sure that we bring genuine value. The idea of we don't bring and interrupt or disrupt a company's operations in the name of bringing value. This is something that is very important for us. And this is why being with Raydiant and being true partners with Neil is very, very important. It's a part of our DNA, our value system. Having the network and making sure that we are true partners, not interfering, only adding value where there's needed. Neil had pointed out very early on that Gary knows when to be there, present, give a thought process, give an opinion, and when to stay away and let Neil take the lead. This is something that we want to make sure that in our fund, this is something that we bring to the table. And every portfolio company has this privilege, has this benefit of what we offer. This is very, very important for us. And we don't want to change this ever. It's every day, it's an ongoing effort. Most of our discussions that Gary and I have is, how can we be real partners and not somebody who is like disrupting and interfering and not letting the CEO handle their affairs? It's really, really that important for us. Coming,
Anna, can I jump in for a second?
Of course.
I think there's a really important point that both Neil and Sheetal are alluding to. But as the founder, you know, I mean, it's from day one that we started this. What makes our model different than other venture capitalists is not just, I wouldn't say we're just a venture fund, right? We're a three-pronged organization. We have a fund, we have the network, but then we have a management company, right? And the idea has always been, again, if you're going to support a company as a partner, not just a capital partner who just gives one round of money, you have to be able to step in and participate at every milestone, okay? And that, for us, that starts from early idea generation all the way through international commercialization and exit. So that's a pretty broad footprint if you think about it. But on the capitalization model, and Neil has actually been the poster child for my model from day one, because we've actually taken advantage of every aspect of that. So, you know, my investment with Neil actually started out with just Gary and Janet, because Neil pointed out our background. And the minute we saw what Neil was doing and Raydiant was doing, we stepped in as investors even before the fund was conceptualized. And then as the company, you know, progressed and developed as individual investors, it became quite obvious to me, given our model and given the focus of our fund and our network, that they were a very important investment for us as well because of where they are. And that's where this becomes important. So if you look at the name, right, it's Global Health Impact Network and Funds. We're not just an investment group. We're not even just a partner. Every company that we invest in has to be able to not only generate revenue from the fund side because of our responsibility to our LPs, but to the network as an impact solution. Now, look, one of the best things about digital health is most solutions that are developed under the digital health umbrella can easily be deployed globally. If you've got a phone, you could pretty much use most of the solutions that we're investing in addition to a device that comes with it that captures the information, right? So for us, the impact becomes very, very important. Now, what Neil and Raydiant are developing is going to basically turn fetal monitoring on its head in a very, very positive way compared to the way we've been doing it for the last 20 years. And, you know, I mean, there are labor and delivery suites all over the world. There are babies delivered in cornfields, right? So, I mean, you know, it's very important for us to have the ability to ensure fetal well-being during the process, from the point of pregnancy all the way through delivery. And they've accomplished that. And that was really the unique attraction for us about Raydiant right from day one. It wasn't, I mean, it was quite clear for me, you know, given my background, that I knew that Raydiant, as it reached its milestones, would progress to the point where it would be a huge return on investment at the end because of what it is in the addressable market that it was in, but more importantly, what it was doing to that market, which is healthcare. And healthcare is a very different vertical. It's complex, it's hard to commercialize in, and it's very difficult to succeed in it unless you've got the right connections at every level, including the clinicians. So it's an important differentiator about what we do and how we're so different than anybody else. And on the capitalization point, which I alluded to, we all alluded to, is so we started out with a fund investment. But then as Neil's needs grew, as he reached his milestones, and I sit on the board as an observer, and I'm always, you know, Neil knows I'm always there listening, they had come up with some capitalization needs, a bridge at one point that preceded an additional round. And we were able to go back to our network and pivot from fund investment to special purpose vehicle bridge investment. And because our investors so understand the importance and the value of Raydiant, I was actually shocked at how we validated what we created when Neil needed a reasonable amount of money in a bridge, and Fetal and I went out and marketed it to the network, and in 2 weeks we raised pretty much most of it, which was not an insignificant number from our network, because everyone said, absolutely, Raydiant, I'll put it whatever money I have into it, because you know, we know this company and we know what it's capable of. And then now they're raising a B round, and we're stepping back and we have a second fund, and the fund is investing in that. So we follow the companies from capitalization needs, not as a venture fund, but as a network that can provide all these different investment vehicles. And it always comes with the support of the network at every level. So we're constantly focusing in on that timeline, the milestones that he wants to reach, and how can we help there? Not just as money, how do we leverage our network? So that's a very, very important market differentiator for GHIF and N.
If I could add something on the impact. Sorry to cut you off, Sheetal. But yeah, Gary was the original investor who saw the impact potential of Raydiant Oximetry. And I, around the same time, I had been introduced to the Gates Foundation. And I had been socializing with the Gates Foundation for 4 years. And I remember at the board, Gary was like, you should take your technology to India. There's a tremendous opportunity for this technology to go to India. A lot of birds there, a lot of interest and innovation. And I never really had the agency, to the permission at the board level to, you know, do work in India. Even though Gary advocated for it, because he was just one voice on the board. And then the Gates Foundation came in and invested and essentially said the same thing that Gary was saying 4 years earlier. And they invested in Raydiant and essentially said, we would like for you to do work globally. And we are now pursuing clinical studies in India. And it's an interesting, you know, circle, because Gary was the first one who saw that potential and advocated for it, and then Gates saw it, and now we're doing it.
Yeah, and it sounds like GHIF and GHIN and the team are comfortable being early. The startup mindset is a huge part of the DNA. So Sheetal, from your perspective as a CFO, who actually has to ensure that you are making prudent investments, can you talk about what that looked like from the CFO perspective and an investor perspective for the fund?
Yeah, of course. There's one slide that I would, yeah, there it is. This is what our trend has been in terms of investing in Raydiant. We started off, so Raydiant is almost 8 years old, if I'm not mistaken. And we started off very early at the seed stage with the first fund. And Neil is one thing I have to give him a lot of credit. He hits his milestones like no founder I've ever interacted with. What he commits, most of the time he delivers before the deadline. I have rarely seen him miss a milestone. And usually if he does, it's because of circumstances out of his control. But he is very on time and with his milestones, a wonderful quality in a founder. So we started off, as Gary had mentioned, really early on. This was GHIF I had invested back in 2019. And when Neil was going to the next stage, when FDA had given the approval for the IDE studies for Raydiant, we wound up raising a SPV of 1.3 million. This SPV was actually raised in 2 weeks. As soon as the FDA had given the go-ahead, the investor interest was really, really high. The third piece, the 1 million bridge round before the Series B, we just literally closed it today morning. We've been discussing this for the last 1 month. The Series B has not opened yet, but we closed the pre-Series B bridge today morning. And right now we are aiming to invest another 3 million to help Neil commercialize. The FDA approvals are coming up. He will need support in commercialization. And both Gary and I are very determined that Neil's entire energy and focus should be on the company. When it comes to fundraising, leave that to us. We will raise the funds and make sure that he's one of the brilliant founders, and we feel confident enough to literally tell him, focus on your milestones, let us do the fundraising for you. So this is where we are at. We are currently raising to make sure that we invest at least 3 million. Honestly, I think we can go as high as 5 million for the Series B from GHIF II. And this entire investment, I mean, yes, supporting Neil, supporting healthcare impact is really, really important. This is also going to give really great returns to our investors and to the fund, and look really great on our track record.
No, thank you. And Neil, congratulations on the recent milestones. We spoke about a lot of milestones. Could you share more about the partnership with GE Healthcare and how you think now as a team about broader clinical adoption and impact you want to create in the world?
Yeah, so my background in GE Healthcare, they are a market leader in fetal monitoring. They make monitors, but specifically they make monitors for fetal monitoring and labor and delivery. And they are often widely considered the #1 market leader in the US and the #2 global market leader. And so GE Healthcare, they've been following us since the beginning. And recently, GE Healthcare spun out of GE. GE was a big conglomerate. They made jet engines, they did banking, they did healthcare, they made washing machines. And then GE broke up, and now they have GE Healthcare, which allowed them to be more nimble. And they started doing diligence about a year ago. They came and visited us a year ago in our office, our technology, our clinical study results. And yeah, it took about a year of deep diligence to establish the partnership and what that partnership would look like. And we were able to finally sign the deal in April and make the announcement in May. They wanted to wait a few weeks until their Q1 earnings call to make the announcement. And so we did make that announcement just a few weeks ago. And what this does for Raydiant is, when you think of any company that's developing a parameter, a vital sign, you essentially have to have equipment to display that vital sign. That equipment is often considered capital equipment. And when you have capital equipment, it's a different sales cycle within the hospital. Sometimes that sales cycle can take up to a year because capital equipment is quite expensive. If you can imagine, our business model is a single-use disposable sensor, which is low cost, but that single-use disposable sensor has to be attached to a module, which is monitoring equipment. And so this partnership with GE allows us to bypass the need for any capital equipment for hospitals to adopt our technology. So we are now developing our technology, so it's literally plug and play into GE fetal monitoring system. So eventually, very soon, when a hospital says, yes, we want to add fetal pulse oximetry to our labor and delivery suite, what a hospital is going to have to do is essentially buy a dongle, to integrate our sensor into their platform. And that dongle, you know, it will be low cost. It'll be trivial, and our technology will be plug and play. So this partnership, in one sense, it validates what we're working on, because GE does very few pre-commercial deals. Normally, if you're developing a new parameter, a new vital sign, you need to go to the market. You need to establish an interest, and then a company like GE will take notice and want to partner. I think with our situation, we were very fortunate that GE saw the vision even before we were on the market. Said, no, we want to have this now, and we don't want to be left out of the party, and so we're going to act now. And that's just going to, so it validates our technology. It eliminates the need for capital equipment, and they also have a very large sales force and very large sales and marketing presence that we can take advantage of. So our capital requirements are actually going to be less to create the splash we need to in the market to achieve an exit.
And what reactions did physicians have? I'm sure you've interacted with a lot of colleagues, both in the diligence process, colleagues like Gary Goldman and Janet Goldman and many others, but what was the response from your peers have been so far?
It's been very validating. It's been great for women's healthcare. So at the same time, there's been this huge conversation about women's healthcare innovation and realization that women's healthcare innovation has been lacking, right? We innovate in everything else, but we don't innovate in women's healthcare, despite the enormous market size and the huge unmet clinical needs. So I think this GE announcement not only validated what we're working on, but it's validating women's healthcare. And I think it's rising tides for the whole ecosystem, which has been great.
And Gary, Fetal, I'm curious how now the investing in Raydiant and the success you've had with Raydiant already, how has this informed your thesis? Are you doubling down in any verticals, any founder types, or how have you taken the learnings and incorporated in your view of the world?
I'll jump in. Sure. It's interesting, again, I use the term evolution a lot because of the way we've grown over the years. And of course, technology is now improving at the speed of light. I mean, clinical information, clinical data is doubling what are they saying now? Like every 68 days, the amount of data that's coming out is doubling. And when we first started, clearly we were very focused on devices that were collecting the data, like Neil's, right? We had other devices that were collecting blood pressure, differently than we do now. And, and there was a lot of technology coming out on the device side. But, at the end of the day, devices themselves, the hard devices, pretty much will change every several years in terms of the improvement of our ability to create miniaturized technology and different types of hardware solutions that come out. But at the end of the day, the real value that comes out of all that is the actual data. And, Neil from day one was collecting a piece of data, which we, by the way, within healthcare tried. It was tried by one of the large strategics years ago. And I was actually my wife and I were part of a study that happened at our institution looking at that, but it was a physical way to monitor it. It was like taking a pulse oximeter you put on a finger and putting it on the baby through a woman's vagina. And the data was incredibly valuable, but collecting it was very difficult because it was trying to hit a moving target when you were using something like that with a baby in utero. And then when he developed it, leveraging new technology, which allowed us to be able to capture it non-invasively through an abdominal sensor, it became a lot easier, and it also made it more applicable throughout many different phases of labor, potentially, as the company grows. So, so for us, we've evolved to the point, is a lot based on what we've learned from Raydiant, to be very focused on Fund 2, not only on the devices, but companies that are now taking the data and using it for patient care. okay? And the way I like to talk about it is, you could look at data as genomic data, which is your DNA, which doesn't change, and phenomic data, which is how you express, your body expresses its genomic data and comes up, and creates different disease states that are precision based on your genomic profile. Well, now what's happening is all that data is being collected. 23andMe, unfortunately, they're not going very well, but the concept of collecting full DNA profiles is happening globally now. And they're tying it to the phenotypic data, the actual patient data, and they're creating a precision model for care. So now when a particular individual, let's say, develops Hodgkin's disease, okay, at 30 years old, they'll be able to go back and look at all the patients, in this database, which will be global, who've had a diagnosis of Hodgkin's disease with a similar pathologic diagnosis, but who also have a very similar genomic profile, in terms of their presentation. And what they're starting to find is that individuals with similar genomic profiles have different response rates to different treatments. They have different outcomes. So we'll be able to go back to a database and say, okay, with this genomic profile, with this diagnosis and this pathology, this is the treatment regimen that is the most highly successful for this particular individual. And that's where I certainly, and our team believes, is the future of healthcare, and clearly the future of where investment should be going in that direction. So those are the companies that we're really focusing in on. I would say that the evolution would be that if Neil came to me now, and how I looked at the company, it might be slightly different, not in a negative way, but just the way we evaluate companies, because we not only look at device companies that are just collecting data, but a lot of the device companies now are starting to create platforms that take the data and evaluate it using machine learning, and then help the clinician to come up with a better diagnosis and treatment as an assisted intelligence platform.
Neil.
Oh, and that's actually part of what GE is doing. They've got a platform called Centricity, and they're taking insights, and they want our biomarker, our vital sign, to be fed into making more actionable, intelligent insights.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for sharing. And now that you have the insights as a venture fund, having been, you're on moving to your second fund as a global health impact fund network, Fund 2. Sheetal, Gary, can you talk to us about some of the successes, some of the lessons learned, and your vision for Fund 2 now, I guess, building on what Gary shared earlier?
Yeah. So Fund 1 is now 7 years old. It's in maintenance mode. It's fully divested. We've already had 2 exits. We had Somnoware back in 2023, and we had UBERDOC early on in January this year. As a matter of fact, UBERDOC is, the acquiring company is heading for a public listing. It wasn't a cash exit. So our share, we are holding shares in a company that is probably heading towards a public listing. We are actively discussing this, and they've already finalized for the Canadian listing. US listing is still to be determined whether we do it. So we would now also have a public listing in our portfolio. We anticipate Raydiant might be the next exit, maybe in late 2026 or early 2027 at the latest. And then there is another portfolio company that's in the space of cardiology, that is Elucid. That will be a very strong exit sometime in 27 or 28. This is where Fund 1 stands. Fund 2 is a larger fund. One of the philosophies of, so there were 2 philosophies where Fund 2 was based on. One was our existing portfolio companies in Fund 1, like Raydiant, would need support going forward. That's why, well, that was also one of the reasons where Fund 2 came in the picture. And we are investing in Raydiant in Series B. The second piece is what Gary highlighted. In the first fund, we looked at devices, at the technology, at the clinician input, which is very important. It is our USP. But we're also looking at data-driven platforms now. This is the additional piece that was a part of our investment thesis for Fund 2. The target of Fund 2 is much higher than Fund 1. We're looking at 50 million overall with a first close of 25 million. And also with the aim, we do want to go a little global with this fund. The first fund was very US-centric, the network and the funds are expanding internationally. We're actively looking into Middle East, we're looking into Asia, Europe, not only to make sure that investors have access to such deals, but also the other way around. We get access to the deal flow coming from these regions. This is how the second fund we're going towards. And one more strongest point that remains with our fund philosophy is we distribute when we exit. We do not hold investor money for 10 years. So when we have an exit and it's a reasonable, strong exit, we actually do a distribution. We had done our first distribution in 2023 with Somnoware. UBERDOC, whenever the public listing will be carried out and we can have an exit, we'll do an distribution, and the same will happen when Raydiant exits. That stays, that is our commitment to our investors. Whenever there's an exit, the fund doesn't hold the money, it goes back to the investors overnight.
Thank you. I'm curious, Neil, from the founder perspective as well, what advice would you give to other founders when they're choosing capital partners and strategic partners? What should they be looking for? Maybe some of the lessons that you've learned along the way.
Yeah,
I'm sure a lot of
taking money from an investor is like a marriage. It really is, and you're so short term in your thinking as a founder. You're trying to survive until tomorrow, until next week. You don't think long term, but you need to, because the relationship between investor and VC lasts longer than many marriages do. And so you don't have the luxury of necessarily picking your investors. You take what you can get, but at the same time, it's makes a lot of sense to make sure you understand what you're getting yourself into and have honest conversations up front, and do your best to get to know them so you know what's in store for you. I'd say that would be my number one advice.
How do you build relationships with investors? How do you call on them? Do you call Gary? Do you call Sheetal? And I know Sheetal spoke about you being really disciplined founder who shares his updates and hits the milestones.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm very intentional to make sure that Gary and or Sheetal hear from me once a week, and it can be a text. Right? It doesn't have to be a big update. It could be, hey, this happened. Hey, how's this? You know, so I'm very disciplined, not just with GHIF, but all of my funds. And that's my job as a CEO of this company. I'm external facing. I'm the face of the company. All the milestones that we hit, I get the credit for, but the reality is I haven't done any of it. My team has done it, right? So I'm very much every day it's about investor management, board management, new investors, potential investors. So I'm very disciplined in giving them updates, and also modulating my conversation based, to make sure it's appropriate for what's going on and what their needs are. And they've got quarterly LP updates, and they might need a little bit more information than I've been giving, right? So just putting myself in their perspective, because I understand that their success is going to translate into my success and vice versa.
Thank you. And I wanted to remind our audience that we can now open for Q&A. So if we have any questions from the audience, would love to hear some of them now. And I think maybe as we wait for the questions, I want to ask Gary for his vision for the network. You spoke about growing and becoming more global, but how do you keep that startup mindset and mentality that helped you in your career?
Yeah, it's interesting because, fortunately, my experience with, as an entrepreneur myself, I had both domestic and international experience. As many of you know, my second company, I was traveling everywhere from Delhi down to Cochin and Shanghai, and we were bringing nurses over during the nursing shortage in the late 90s. So that really developed my ability to learn and understand what it takes to create those relationships to be successful internationally. And we're translating that experience that I've had experience with other companies to create an environment on the network that also can help portfolio companies. So as Neil said, when he decides after speaking to me and then several years later to Gates and says, we really do need to go to India, that we can go back and say, okay, well, this is, depending on where in India, if you're in the south in Cochin, or if you're up north in Delhi, this is who you need to talk to, because companies can waste lots of money and lots of time trying to develop those relationships. And there have been companies that actually wound up failing from a commercialization perspective because they could easily scale up the company domestically, but not internationally, because of those kind of failures of not knowing who to go to and wasting millions of dollars. So, so that's one part of it. The other part of it is to treat it like a portfolio company and how valuation is important. We're starting to work on now different models to create revenue streams through sponsorships. We now have, again, a network of several thousand clinicians, and there's lots of organizations like a GE, like a Medtronics, like clinical studies, pharmaceutical companies that would like to get in front of 20 cardiologists and 50 pulmonologists. And we have communities for all of those things. Not every one of them is everyday active, but they're there available to us to act as advisors, mentors, and provide opportunities for them to actively participate as subject matter experts. So we're building the network from that component. But now, and we didn't really talk about it, we started a third fund, and the third fund is in dentistry. And, you see on my name up there, I got a lot of letters after it, that I was a dentist first. So now we're creating a dental network and a dental fund. And then in parallel, we partnered with a company now that is a veterinary network everywhere in India, from Delhi down to Cochin. And they would like to expand their model internationally. So we're looking at creating a veterinary network and venture fund, which, again, both of those can be international. So we're not limited to just physicians, not just medicine. We're health professionals. We're across multiple different specialties and professions and verticals. And we're really trying to become that agnostic place where any organization, any association, any society could come to us and leverage our network and provide resources to our members, so it's a benefit in both directions. So that really is my mindset for the network now. Now, I wish I could clone myself and have 5 of me. So we're expanding our team significantly with lots of healthcare MBAs that are sharing the same mission and vision. But it really is, it's a very time-consuming model, but it is very worthwhile and very rewarding because of the impact of what we're creating.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gary. Neil, we have one question for you about the patent portfolio. That's very impressive. 46 patents that are pending. And what's the expected timeline? I know some of this may be confidential and proprietary, but if you could shed some light on this, would be great.
Yeah, so some of our IP is core, and some of it is a fence around our core IP. And so we have to be very strategic, because the costs grow exponentially, because you have to maintain these patents every year. And so we decide what's core, and what's core you can fast track, at least in the US. When you fast track, it's called a track 1 application. You can usually get the IP within about 12 months. So we'll fast track, and that takes about a year. But if you don't fast track, it could take about 2 to 3 years. And so we tend to fast track what's core in the US, and then some of those applications are also international. And so, for example, we've started doing some India filings because we're doing work in India. Europe is a big market for us, so we're very selective. One of our devices is in the postpartum hemorrhage space, so that is a different market than the fetal monitoring. So it's a full-time job just managing the IP in of itself.
And I think as a follow-up to that question was what clinics you're working, if you're working with Mayo Cleveland already.
Mayo Clinic or Mayo?
Mayo Clinic, correct.
Yeah, Mayo Clinic. Yeah. So for our postpartum hemorrhage device, we are instituting Mayo Clinic. The obstetrician, her name is Dr. Alyssa Larish, and she is going to be our site PI at Mayo in Rochester for our upcoming postpartum hemorrhage study. So yes, we are working with Mayo.
Thank you. Curious, I think navigating US regulatory environment is never easy. If you could speak to some of those milestones as well.
Yeah, especially in women's health and for devices that involve pregnancy. So you can imagine pregnancy is a very hard population to do clinical research with. And, there's a very high burden that the FDA holds companies innovating in pregnancy space. Because remember, the FDA represents people and they want to make sure that these devices are safe and we're not going to harm any pregnant women and any unborn babies. But at the same time, the FDA is full of people, and a lot of people that work in the women's healthcare division at the FDA are moms. They've all had babies. So I think we approach it as any other strategic conversation, right? There is the agency point of view, and then there's the personal point of view. And they get it. They get what we're working on. They get why we're working on it. And I think that's one of the things that when you realize will help you in your conversations navigating with the FDA. We were able to get breakthrough status for our fetal pulse oximetry device. And there are only 4 companies with breakthrough status in women's healthcare. And that allows us to have frequent conversations and puts us in a whole different bucket of priorities. And so our lead reviewer, he's given us his personal text. So we can text him. That's how we communicate with them because we've established that relationship. So everything sort of, I guess our sort of modus operandus is when we deal with FDA or investors or VCs, it's working hard to establish a strong, authentic relationship.
Thank you very much, Neil. And I think as in closing, we have one question about referring deals and opportunities to Global Health Impact Network and Fund. If Sheetal, Gary could share about what are you looking for in opportunities now? What's the best way to do that? Who are you looking to partner with as the next generation of startups for Fund 2?
Sheetal, you want to start or you want me to take this?
Yeah.
Either way.
Start. So our investment thesis is broadly similar, that we are still looking at devices, digital health, telemedicine. The generation of data and utilization is an important key factor, as I had mentioned earlier. So that will definitely continue. Now, because the size of the fund is bigger, there are 2 pieces with this. Yes, we can support with larger check sizes, but at the same time, we can also support a larger number of portfolio companies. Fund 1 had 10 portfolio companies with an average check size from 300,000 going up to 1.2, 1.3 million. We have capacity to go for bigger checks. Like for Raydiant itself, we are going for 3 million plus. So this, our ability to sign bigger checks is definitely stronger. And the last piece is we are live to support startups which are trying to go global or which are based in different geographies, since our scope has expanded. So all of this we'll be able to support in all these areas.
If I could add a comment as well, from the founder's perspective. So Gary and I had been socializing for almost a year before he made a personal investment, and almost a year and a half before the fund made an investment. Our last VC fund that led our last round, Impact Fund out of Canada, they had been following Raydiant for 4 years before they made an investment. Gates Foundation took 4 years before they made an investment. GE had been following us for 6 years. So these relationships take time to develop and mature. It's almost like dating. You don't date for a month and then decide to get married. It takes a long time. And you have to be very patient and very intentional, and it's a lot of work, frankly. Right, I'm talking to a lot of potential new investors for Series B, and I'm trying to court and develop that relationship. And is this in addition to keeping our existing investors happy? So it takes a lot of patience and a lot of effort.
Yeah, and I think on the venture capital side of that, and again, having been in both chairs, I frequently am on a lot of panels, and I'm always asked the question, well, what are you looking for in companies? Obviously, we just talked a little bit about stage, and that just depends on the size of the fund. But a very, very important part of that is what Neil brings up, which is the relationship. Because if I had $1 for every time there was a great idea that failed because of the management, because of the quality of the management team, or the approach of the management team not open enough to take feedback and help from their investors in a positive way, of course, that would be a positive relationship. Those are the companies that tend to have good ideas but never get anywhere. And then there are, obviously good idea and good management team, which is what we have with Raydiant. Those are the ones that lead to the very great successes. And then there are companies, and I'll leave out the names, but we've had companies that, they were small investments, they were very questionable, they were great ideas. It wasn't very clear how the management team was going to be able to accomplish what they did, but with the support of our network and our model, we've had teams that have evolved, have changed, based on what was necessary, and companies that I thought probably were unlikely to succeed wound up exiting and succeeding. So it really is a partnership, and it doesn't happen overnight. And Neil is completely correct. And I think that's one of the mistakes that a lot of founders make is, they'll approach you about an investment and, well, how long is this due diligence going to take? And we're not sure if we can wait and all of that. And, I think, when I start hearing that, it's concerning, and it raises certainly my red flags, because I think, until a founder understands that it's not just about the money, it's about how you have aligned incentives, just like healthcare, and it improve, you'll have better outcomes when you have aligned incentives and you're both thinking the same way, as opposed to you're both fighting about it all the time. So it's an area which is not necessarily as easy to understand, but it's extremely important on both sides of the relationship.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to the participants. This was a wonderful conversation. We always learned a lot. Thank you to the guests. And we'll be posting the webinar on LinkedIn and other social media platforms. Please join the network, continue supporting Raydiant and following the companies and the founders. And we're really grateful, and have a great start to the week. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Anna. Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Sheetal.